All right, one of the things that we love to do here on Seize the Day is to hear about great conversion stories. We call it our Conversion Corner here on the program. Ah, yes, the Conversion Corner. It's a place where we go where I like to say I meet people that maybe never dreamed they would darken the doorstep of a Catholic church, and yet today they find that they are one. Well, joining us in our Conversion Corner this morning, a man who has a fascinating story. Scott Woltze is with us. Scott, good morning. Welcome to Seize the Day, man.
Hey, good morning from the West Coast.
Great to have you. Where on the West Coast are you?
I'm in Portland, Oregon.
So it is dark and early there, eh?
Yeah, the family's asleep upstairs, yeah.
Oh, that's good. So you snuck downstairs and you just got yourself out. Have you had your first cup of coffee yet?
I've had a big cup of tea, yeah.
Oh, good enough. All right, a little caffeine in the system never hurt anything. Well, and you mentioned it here, Scott. So let me just start out with that. What time do you typically get up every day?
Well, we're late risers. Our kids are night owls, and so we get up at about 8.
Wow, are you a night owl too?
I am, yeah, I always have been.
Okay. Well, then I'll share something with you that I shared with my listeners a little bit earlier this morning. I've been using a little book by Thomas à Kempis as my daily meditation book today. And here is one of the quotes from my meditation this morning. Thomas à Kempis says, "He who is lukewarm in the morning rarely becomes fervent by evening." So just whatever time you get up, Scott, don't be lukewarm, okay?
Amen.
Good stuff. Well, listen, you're in our Conversion Corner, so we know, obviously, that these days you are a Catholic, but it hasn't always been that way.
No.
So why don't you take us back to the beginning? Tell me, first of all, about your early family life, when you were a kid growing up.
Sure.
Did your family go to church? Were you church-going people at all? How did that work for you at the beginning?
Yeah, basically, I would say that my spiritual life was kind of split in two because on the one hand, I had the kind of Catholic upbringing a lot of people did in the 70s and 80s. There wasn't much catechesis. The music was pretty bad. You've heard the story 100 times. But on the other hand, I also had some relatives who were tremendously dedicated to the faith. And there was a little rural parish that I used to go to where my grandparents lived. And that parish was a tremendous example. But unfortunately, I didn't keep the faith. Like a lot of people, there was a lot of conflict in my home, and obviously we all have to suffer. But life really turns on how you respond to that suffering. And
how did you respond?
Well, I always responded in the worst way possible. So, yeah, I didn't reach out to Christ. Instead, I'd always turn inward, I'd retreat into myself like a fortress, and I'd try to rely on my own strength and resources. And so when I was 13, I explicitly rejected God. There was a blow-up in the home again, and I ran out the house, and I was running, I saw a big Douglas fir tree, and I stopped in front of the tree, and I talked to that tree like the tree was God, and I said, where have you been? How can you do this to me? I've had enough of you. I never want to hear from you again. And that was it. From then on, I relied on a strategy of self-reliance.
Now, when you say you relied on a strategy of self-reliance, would you say, Scott, that at that point, did you become an atheist? Did you become an agnostic? Did you totally reject God? Or was there always kind of, at least maybe hidden way back in the background, this belief and relationship with God?
Well, obviously when I was 13, I believed in God because I talked to God in the person of the tree.
Right.
But I think what happens to most young people is that belief in God and a lot of that early grace you get when you're a child. It really becomes covered up in sin, and really the more you sin, and sin forces a choice upon you, right? And the more you sin, you eventually either have to say, look, there's no God at all, or you have to come back to God, right? And so like a lot of people, I was officially agnostic because I later became a decent enough philosopher to figure out that agnosticism was the way to go, because I couldn't explicitly say there's no God as atheist.
Sure. Well, and if I may, agnosticism rather than like full-blown atheism.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I was practically an atheist. I lived like an atheist.
Sure. Yeah. Or at least very much of a pagan, right?
Sure, exactly. So anyway, so this strategy of self-reliance, it actually seemed to bear fruit. One day when I was 16, there was conflict in the home again, but this time I was able to defend myself. I was, older, and I had trained as a boxer for a while. And so once I defended myself, I knew that all the conflict in my home was over. For some reason, I just knew it, and I was right. And this gave me a tremendous feeling of control, liberation, exhilaration. But the problem is, I kind of turned this liberation into an ugly thing. I vowed that I was never going to be at the mercy of anyone again, and I really had a big nasty chip on my shoulder at that point.
Scott Woltze, by the way, is with us in our Conversion Corner here on Seize the Day, and I'm Gus Lloyd on the Catholic Channel on SiriusXM 129. Hey, if you're interested in learning more about Scott, by the way, you can find him online. He's got a blog. It's at bringustolife.blogspot.com. Now, a couple of quick questions for you here, Scott. When you talk about conflict in the home, I gather from the fact that you said that, you had learned to box and whatnot, we're talking about physical conflict. Was there physical violence in the home?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't as bad as some people go through, but it was bad enough. Yeah.
Yeah. So that really kind of helped to shape and form you. Now, when you reach this point of freedom that you talked about, and of course, you can tell us a little bit more about false freedom and true freedom. But when you reach this point of freedom, you say that you felt this kind of liberation. Do you mean that from a temporal perspective and or a spiritual perspective?
Yeah, it was both, and I wish I'd known that at the time, because because there was something good about it. Obviously, I was now essentially safe in my own home, but the problem was there was a kind of spiritual liberation, but it was really towards darkness. And so that's where this sort of exhilaration came from, where I enjoyed this feeling of power and control. And so, in fact, I enjoyed that feeling so much that I began committing more and more crimes, mostly thefts, some large thefts, some small thefts like shoplifting. And I'd do a lot of vandalism and stuff. And because running around at all hours of the night, doing whatever I wanted to whomever I wanted, including fights and stuff, it returned that feeling of sort of power and control. And in part, it was also these crimes. They were also a way of sort of sticking it to the world, so to speak.
Sure.
I'd come to the conclusion that there's no justice in the world, life's not fair, and so my attitude was, well, fine, I'll stick it to you. So, eventually, I raised the stakes to robbing banks. And so at the age of 18, I set upon the really crazy path of robbing banks. And, in part it's because, there really was at the heart of me a kind of metaphysical despair, because I was alienated, not just from other people, but from God, and I was alienated even from myself. And so I had this very strange idea that robbing banks would cause a kind of metaphysical breakthrough where I'd see the world as it really was, almost like that it was so out of the ordinary that it would split the universe in two. It's a very strange view, but in my defense, that's actually the main theme of the novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Captain Ahab sets about to capture Moby Dick the white whale, and he thinks that in doing so he'll be able to kind of stick it to God or the universe, and he'll reach beyond what he sees around him into the true core of life. So anyway,
that's fascinating, Scott Woltze.
Yeah,
it's very fascinating. Scott Woltze is with us this morning. I've never heard anybody delve so deeply into robbing banks. That's a first for me, Scott, and it truly is. It's truly fascinating. There's something though that I want to have you expand on just a little bit, because I think this is very key. You use the word empowered when you were doing bad stuff, when you were committing acts of vandalism, when you were robbing banks and stuff like that. You said that you felt empowered. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I'm fascinated by how so oftentimes when we really boil stuff down to the core, oftentimes it is a sense of power, as though we want to power and control. Maybe that would be a word that I think more people could relate to. It's this idea of control, where we want to be in control. We want to be in control of every situation. And that's really sort of what you got from these acts that you were committing, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an interesting, you stated it well, so I won't regurgitate what you just said, but I think there's an interesting balance that happens, and it's really a balance in our souls that in the end can determine, whether we enjoy the beatific vision with God forever or frankly go to hell. And that's that how far do you take this desire for power and control? And fortunately, in my case, whereas I was doing lots of horrible things, I always had serious boundaries that I was not willing to cross. And that even carried through when I went to prison. But one example, on the third robbery, I decided to rob the whole bank. And fortunately, there were no customers in the bank at the time. But I went in there and, the tellers saw me and they froze. They would not move. It was really sad. And, that episode just disturbed me to my deepest core, because I hated the fact that I had become really such a monster, so to speak, that these poor ladies were just terrified and could not even move. They were stuck like statues. And so, I guess what I would say is those who completely give in to darkness, they actually enjoy that control over people. But I hated it. I really hated it. And later on, when I was in prison, this guy jumped me. In other words, he, out of the blue, he tried to beat me up, right? Anyway, and I got the better of him. And it was a similar situation. I had him on the ground, and I was beating on him. And I'm sorry for the graphic content, but
it's part of the story, and actually, Scott, it's part of the story. So thank you for sharing it with us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I actually.
So when you were beating this guy up, you actually felt badly about it.
I did. People who've been in fights know that time sort of slows down when you're in a fight, and so you actually have time to make decisions. And I had this guy's hair, and I was hitting his head against the concrete. I know it's terrible. And I stopped. I just thought, no, I'm not gonna. I could kill this guy. I don't want to kill this guy. We're just having a stupid argument over work. And so, I stopped and I let him get up. Which isn't the smartest thing, but I didn't want to, I didn't want to seriously injure him. I just wanted to make him go away, basically. You know what I mean?
So if I could put it like this, and this may not be, the perfect way to put it, but you were a crook with a conscience.
Yeah, I really was. And in fact, it's interesting. Your listeners might find this fascinating. After I got arrested, they sent me to a maximum security prison, and those prisons, at least when I was there, they were governed by something called convict justice, right? In other words, prison is its own little society with its own little rules, whatnot. And I actually learned a kind of basic respect for persons and their property in prison, something that I did not have when I was running around in the streets, just randomly, randomly picking fights and things like that. And so, oddly enough, I actually became a better person when I was in maximum security prison than I'd been on the outside.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. And now, did that then translate, Scott, to your life on the outside after you were released from prison? Did you then take those values that you just admitted you had learned in prison, did you take those into the outside world?
No, I didn't. It's kind of sad. One bad thing that happened was, of course, the fact that I was able to be in a maximum security prison at the age of 18 and thrive, that actually fed, that ego and that commitment to self-reliance that I had, that chip on my shoulder, that no one could mess with me, because I was like, see, no one can mess with me. I'm 18 and I made it in a maximum security prison. So there was that negative flip side. But what happened when I got out was, like a lot of young men today, I consistently betrayed the women I dated. And so while I was in prison, I actually formed very deep friendships and had a lot of convict buddies. And I never would have dreamed, in 1,000 years when I was in prison, of betraying my convict buddies. And it wasn't just because there'd be consequences, which there would, of course, but they were my friends. I'd never betray them. But of course, once I get out into the world, in this current, world of sexual liberation, women I cared about and had a lot of affection for, I consistently cheated on them and basically treated them badly in other ways too. So, in fact, that's kind of where I came to my second crisis in life. Was, my first crisis obviously was when I was 18 robbing banks, and the second crisis was when I was in my early 30s and, I could barely look at myself in the mirror. On the surface, it looked like I was a tremendous success story, because what happened was when I was in prison, I'd begun studying the classics of Western civilization, and I really started to flourish as an academic. And then I got out of prison and progressively worked my way up through the academia and ended up at the University of Michigan working on my doctoral studies in political philosophy. And so on the surface, I looked like this success story. But deep down, I knew that I was a terrible person. I didn't like who I was at all. I didn't like the way I treated people. And so, really, in many ways, I was the Walking Dead, Yeah, and,
well, you part of a TV show, and you could have been an even bigger success. I'm just kidding. The Walking Dead.
Scary.
Okay. Yeah. Scott Woltze. I'm sorry. Scott Woltze is with us this morning in our conversion corner here on Seize the Day on the Catholic Channel on SiriusXM 129. And I am Gus Lloyd. I got to tell you, Scott, you have a most fascinating story. Now, listen, I wonder, do you have a few more minutes? I got to take a quick break here. Can you come back after the break and we'll hear the rest of the story?
Yeah, sounds great.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. All right. Scott Woltze with us this morning here on Seize the Day. So, here, I'll tell you what, we're just going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we're going to hear the rest of the story. Scott was telling us the story about how he grew up in something of an abusive house and had a lot of challenges. Then at 18, started robbing banks, did some time in prison, got out of prison, became quite a successful man. But was that success real success? We're going to hear the rest of the story coming up next. Seize the Day on the Catholic Channel on SiriusXM 129. Seize the Day. Good morning, my friend, and welcome. I am Gus Lloyd. We are in the conversion corner this morning, and our guest this morning is Scott Woltze. Scott has been telling us the story of his early life. Had some difficult circumstances, challenges, like we all do. And at 18 years old, he began to rob some banks. Well, that landed him in prison, and he was telling us about his time in prison, how he was released from prison and got into academia. So, Scott, thank you once again for being here. It's a fascinating story, and I really appreciate you telling it to us. Now, let's kind of pick up the story from where you left off, where you talked about you went to the University of Michigan, were working on your PhD, and in the eyes of the world, you looked like a really great success. But you said, Scott, I knew in my heart that I wasn't a very good person, and you felt like things needed to change. So what happened from there?
Well, so basically what God had done is he'd shown me, that all my idols, those things that I believed in, gave my life meaning and pleasure, that they couldn't make me happy. And so that was women, academics, and then also my health. And so God took those things away from me one by one, showing me that, look, you'll never find happiness pursuing these things. And so, unfortunately, I didn't have a plan B. I think that's something a lot of your listeners who have fallen away relatives need to understand, is that, a lot of people who've lost their faith, they know that whatever they currently believe in and care about, that it might just be grass, it might just be sand slipping through their fingers. And they do actually want something else, but they don't think there's anything else out there. And so I never would have dreamed in 1,000 years, for example, that Christianity was true. So anyway, but the decisive moment came in April of 2007. I just turned in my grades the night before, and I was mowing my lawn. And as I mowed my lawn, I kept kicking myself. I was so angry at myself because I had this young female friend, and I was putting pressure on her. And she was an evangelical and a born-again virgin, and she had a very hard life. And I told her, I said, look, if we start dating, I'm not the kind of guy to wait for marriage. And she was extremely hurt by that. And I was just, afterwards, I was so angry at myself that I'd hurt this, lovely young person. Because I knew at that point that, dating, romance, sex, stuff like that, it didn't make me happy. And so why was I violating this woman's values and who she was at her core, just for my selfish desire? So I was extremely angry at myself, and it really was the last straw. A priest would say I had perfect contrition at that point, meaning really there was no attachment to that sin anymore. I was done. I just had no interest in treating women that way. And so as I mowed my lawn, all of a sudden I turned a corner, and this divine voice stopped all thoughts and sensations in my mind. And this voice presented itself fully and clearly on my mind and said, I love you and I forgive you. And afterwards, this immense love, this perfectly pure, perfect love that I'd never dreamed possible, sort of gently exploded in my chest and slowly spread up to my head and down to my toes. And along with this love, all of a sudden, I found two thoughts or little pieces of knowledge that God had put in my mind. Theologians would call it infused knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And the first thought was that God had removed the chip on my shoulder. And sure enough, I searched inside myself, to see if I still had that wariness, that mistrust that ex-convicts often have, right? And it was really gone, and I think God did that because he wanted me, of course, to be a changed man. And he knew I needed a lot of help. And so he removed that chip on my shoulder. And it's never come back, by the way. And the second thought was that I knew that his purpose, his plan, was to restore me to the little boy that I'd been 25 years before, before the problems at home and then my own sins had made me the ugly person I'd become at the age of 33.
Sure. Would it be fair to say, Scott, that you felt that you were now a beloved son?
Well, I wouldn't put it in those exact terms, because that actually sounds a lot like Christianity, of course. And unfortunately, at that point, I didn't know that God, that it was, the God who was the Holy Trinity,
sure,
and it was the Holy Spirit who had touched me.
Well, let me ask you this though: when that happened, in that moment, which was obviously a very profound moment.
Oh yeah.
What was it? I'm guessing, but you tell me. I'll put it in the form of a question. Was it completely unexpected? Was it completely out of the blue? And what was your response? What was your reaction? Because you say, well, that the way you put it, Gus, would be a whole lot like Christianity. So what were you thinking? Who was it that was talking to you? And how did that being become manifest in your brain?
So what I basically thought was, wow, there's a God who's up there. He intimately knows me and loves me. He wants me to be a completely different person, or I wouldn't say completely different, but he wants me, to be a good person. And all I knew was that I wanted to find this God. I didn't care about anything else. I was supposed to spend that summer writing my dissertation, and I spent almost no time on my dissertation because if you actually feel the love of God, it's unlike anything else. It doesn't matter. To even describe it as a pleasure sort of seems to desacralize it, right? Because it's so completely pure and perfect. But it's really, it completely dwarfs any kind of earthly pleasure you can imagine. Now maybe there are things that are like it, like the birth of your child or something like that. Those can kind of give you a very weak approximation. But the love of God is just, it's overpowering. It doesn't overpower our will, of course, but it makes you so hungry to feel it again that all I did was just try to find out who's this God and what can I do to make him happy. Unfortunately, real quick, I actually settled into a very common view today about God, and it was a theistic view, a view that there's a God up there and he's watching and he knows me and he loves me. But I didn't understand that I'd have to put on the mind of Christ and that I'd really have to go through a radical transformation, I didn't have that sense of the depths to which I'd have to, the depth of conversion I'd have to have.
Sure, and let me ask you, Scott, that kind of attitude, because I find this really fascinating.
Sure.
Does that kind of attitude sort of come out like this? Well, look, I know there's a God there, but he doesn't really have any expectations of me. I mean, he's up there, he's kind of looking down on us, but I can just do whatever I want to do, and he's still there. Does that sound pretty close?
Yeah, I mean, I knew I had to be a better person. That was clear. But I still thought things like sex before marriage would be okay. Now, God very quickly, disabused me of that notion. But
right.
I would say the next day or two after the conversion, I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to treat women badly. But boy, isn't it crazy to get married before you have sex with a woman? I mean, I had a lot of the attitudes still that young men do today.
Sure.
But what really changed it, and it's another supernatural experience, in some ways even more extreme than the one I just told. What really changed it was this love that was in me. It slowly faded after 3 days, right? It just kind of slowly drained out of me. And on the third night, I decided to go running at a park with my dogs, Maybury Park in Michigan. And right when I arrived at the park, all these evil thoughts kept going through my mind. And there was such a insistence about these thoughts, and they were not thoughts that I'd ever have myself. And what was even more mysterious was that these thoughts were coming from just outside of me, right? I could tell. It's like God had lifted the little veil. Normally, when we have an evil suggestion from a demon, for example, we can't. It's not obvious unless you're, relatively holy, that it's coming from outside of you, right? But God, through the Holy Spirit anyway, made it extremely clear that these were not my own thoughts. They were sort of being subtly pushed into my mind. And so I started my run, and I was talking to God. God was not answering, of course, but, as I was running frantically, talking to God, saying, are there demons? There must be demons. And so I went on like this for a mile or so, and then I emerged out of some woods into an intersection of paths and dirt roads. And all of a sudden, up against the moon, coming down a road toward me, God showed me for a couple seconds this horde of demons who were, barreling down the road towards me. Now, I knew at the time that I was in God's protection, and so I wasn't afraid, actually. I was obviously very surprised. But, they were basically, there was like a sort of spiritual demilitarized zone between me and these demons that I saw of about 50 yards. And so, I'd say there were about 1,000 of them. And, that it was actually that episode that radically changed everything in me, because the first episode, 3 days before, I knew there was a God who intimately loved me and knew me, and I wanted to, live in his shadow and his pleasure. But this episode showed me that there is really something like spiritual combat, that there is an immense evil, an unseen spiritual evil that we have to, be vigilant against. And once I saw the demons, I knew that one of the Abraham religions, right, Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, I knew one of them must be true, because other religions like Buddhism and whatnot, they don't have a view of demons, of course, and so I knew that one of those three religions must be true, and it was now a question of which one.
Scott Woltze is in our Conversion Corner this morning here on Seize the Day on the Catholic Channel on SiriusXM 129. And he's been telling us the story about how he started off life as a person really with no religion per se, and then at the age of 18 began to rob banks and did some time in prison, got out of prison, got into academia, was very successful, and now he's been talking about this encounter that he had with the divine, and not only the divine, but the demonic as well, showing him very clearly that there are two sides to this spiritual battle that we're involved in. Scott, I got to take another break. Can you hang on for just a couple of minutes, because I got to hear the end of this story. This is going to be great.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time, by the way. I really do appreciate it. Scott Woltze is with us this morning here on Seize the Day on the Catholic Channel on SiriusXM 129. So do me a favor, hang in there. Don't go anywhere. We'll be gone for just a couple of moments here. And when we come back, we are going to hear the conclusion of the story and how Scott invariably found his way into the Catholic Church. Our Conversion Corner, I'm Gus Lloyd. Stick around. More Seize the Day when we return here on the Catholic Channel.
Seize the Day with Gus Lloyd on the Catholic Channel, SiriusXM 129.
Hey, good morning, my friend. Welcome to Seize the Day. I am Gus Lloyd. We are in our Conversion Corner, and our guest this morning is Scott Woltze. If you're just now tuning in, let me just kind of give you the Reader's Digest version of his story up to now anyway. Scott had a reasonably interesting childhood and sort of gave up on any idea of religion or God at the age of 13. And at the age of 18, he started to rob banks and did some time in prison. After he got out of prison, he went into academia and was leading what to many would seem a very successful life. Scott himself said, though, that he didn't feel like he was a very good person. And then he had an encounter with the divine. He told us the story about an encounter that he had with God and how God showed him the other side of the spiritual battle when he came face to face with a legion of demons. And now we're at the point in the story where he has to kind of make a decision. Scott, you said earlier that you knew that one of the Abrahamic religions would be, one of the true religions, because those are the religions, meaning Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, that sort of, that believe in demons and in the other side of the spiritual battle. So how did you decide which of those was going to be the right one?
Yeah. Well, let me just say one more thing to your listeners. And, I obviously spent a lot of time in academia, and I ran into a lot of just incredibly smart people who are at the top of their field, in economics and philosophy and political science, and people much smarter than I am. And none of those people could ever have imagined to be true what the things that I'd experienced. In other words, to all these professors that I'd known, many of them kind people, they never, ever would have guessed that there would be something like demons and something like the Christian God, the God faithful to the Bible that he's given us. So I would just like to, get that out there right away. And so, so my whole worldview at this point, like any secular humanist, my whole worldview was overturned completely. And the first thought I had, when I saw those demons, the very first thought I had was, oh my goodness, a medieval farmer had a more accurate understanding of human life than I did. Right? Seriously.
Yeah,
I read all these books.
Right, which is kind of a slap in the face to an academic, right?
It really is. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So anyway, so I was very mistrustful towards my intellect and towards my education, since everything I had previously thought was wrong, or most things were wrong. And so I wanted to go very slowly. I didn't want to make another mistake again. I didn't want my intellect to run away from me and end up losing this sense of this God who loved me so much by letting my mind go down false paths, right? So I was going to be very, very careful. And so the next morning, when I woke up after the run, I was just laying in bed. I was just exhausted because my life had been completely turned upside down in the last 3 days, and I hadn't slept much either. And I noticed that in the upper left corner of my line of sight, there was a small circular image about the size of a silver dollar held 12 inches away, and that this small circular image, that it was there imprinted in my mind, right? It was like stamped in my mind, and it was there no matter where I looked. So if I looked up, it was there. If I looked down, even if I closed my eyes. And what the image was it was a small picture of a man from the waist up, and the man was just looking at me. He had, long, thick, dark hair, and he, I thought it was a picture, right? I just thought it was a picture of a man, and I thought that God was telling me that I needed to study this person, right? That he was showing me, this is where you need to go, Scott. And my first thought was, maybe it's Plato or Aristotle or Socrates, because, I was a political philosopher, and I wanted to stay with what's familiar, but I quickly dismissed it because the man did not look like Plato or Socrates. And I knew, because of the fact of demons, that it had to be some religious figure. So I thought, maybe it's Elisha or someone like that. I wanted it to be anybody but Jesus.
Anybody but Jesus, right.
Anybody but Jesus. I mean, it's,
sure.
The only way I could explain it, because, I'd actually never been anti-religious. When I would teach, I was actually glad when I would have a genuine Christian in my class, because I respected their courage, for one, because most of their peers weren't on board, of course. I respected their courage, and they were different. They had a different worldview, and so I was actually very protective, kind of like a mother hen, when I had a real Christian in my classes. So anyway, I was never anti-religious, but I think I wanted to be anyone but Jesus, because for 20 years I'd lived outside of God's friendship. And of course, as we know, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And so I still had that sort of, reaction towards him.
Right. So anyway. This was God's way of revealing himself to you through the person of Jesus Christ. Now, I gotta, we got to, I want to get to the part of the story where, so let me just ask it like this. When God revealed to you that, revealed himself in the person of Jesus, and I'm assuming then that you knew that Christianity was the way to go, did you automatically gravitate towards Catholicism? And if not, tell me about that journey.
Sure, let's get ahead. So, I figured out the man was Jesus after about, that image was stuck in my mind for about 10 days, and maybe day 5 or 6, the image never said anything, but the man's hair gently blue, right? And so I figured out it wasn't an image. It wasn't just a picture, that it was an actual man staring at me, right, from a tiny picture inside my mind. And once I knew that it was a real man and not just a picture, I admitted it was Jesus. I think deep down, I hid it from myself, so to speak. But once I knew it was a real man looking at me, I couldn't keep up the deception. And I said, it's Jesus. Yes, it's Jesus. Anyway, and since I was trained as an academic, I don't want to offend our Protestant listeners, but, among academics anyway, who don't have any stake in whether Catholicism or Protestantism is true, et cetera, and many academics are Jewish, of course, so they really don't have a stake. Anyone who's familiar with the history of ideas, the history of institutions, like I was, you just kind of know that, hey, look, I mean, there was no Protestantism until Martin Luther, you know what I mean? And sure. So among academics, secular academics, the working assumption is that Catholicism, and then the split from Orthodoxy in, 1000 or whatever, that's obviously historical Christianity, right? So there's no doubt for a secular humanist that Catholicism is sort of the beginning of Christianity, right? And so since I knew that Protestantism came along, 500 years ago, there was never really any question of whether, of becoming a Protestant. So I knew that I was going to give Catholicism the first shot, and I thought that if I didn't find the home of the God I'd met there, I was going to try the Eastern Orthodox. And so I remembered from my childhood, we'd gone to an old Latin Mass a few times, more than a few times, and I remembered there was just something extraordinary about it. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to search online. I went on the internet, and I Googled, old Latin Mass, and in Detroit, there's actually a whole bunch of parishes that do that. And this was before Pope Benedict, liberated that Mass, so to speak. Anyway, so I found one, an old Polish church, downtown Detroit, beautiful building. I thought, okay, let's give it a shot, And so I went there, and I was very nervous, in part because I don't speak Latin, right? But
right.
Anyway, I picked up the missal, which had Latin on one side and English on the other, and I was nervous. And then all of a sudden, the cantor who was up behind me in the loft, he started to begin the Mass with Gregorian chant, the Asperges May, and literally, and the congregation joined them. And in the first two words, I knew that the Catholic Church was, God's resting place. I had that sense of, God again. I had an enormous sense of peace and comfort, and I knew I was home, and I knew I'd never leave. And I mean, it's been, the last 7 years have been the happiest 7 years of my life, and I never knew that people could be so happy on earth.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, Scott, because I've talked to thousands of converts in my day, and everyone has a very unique story. It's interesting though that Protestantism or any other, if you will, I'll use a word here that isn't correct, but I'll use it anyway, brand of Christianity,
sure,
never really even entered your mind, and that's to be quite honest with you, that's a little bit unusual for a lot of the conversion corner stories that we hear. But it's very, very interesting. So you were accepted into full communion. I guess you had to go through RCIA, right? You had to find out a little bit more about this whole Catholicism thing.
Well, I'd been baptized Catholic, and I'd been confirmed Catholic even.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I actually had even worked for the church for a year in basically property development in between the time I finished undergrad studies and graduate school. And so, I just viewed it as a job where I was helping people, So I enjoyed the job, but I had no intention of joining the church. Although I did meet Cardinal Ruini, and he's a tremendous man. I was privileged to take him hiking. And the poor man, he asked me, because he knew I was a political philosopher, he asked me who my favorite philosopher was. And I told him Machiavelli, which, for your listeners in the know, he's probably the most anti-Christian writer. Right. But he just smiled and laughed. And Italians have a weakness for Machiavelli because Machiavelli was Italian. So he was very gracious, thank goodness. But he maybe should have given me a stern lecture right there, but
right, you know, Augustine, Aquinas, anybody but Machiavelli, please. Right,
exactly.
Well, yeah. Listen, hey, I've run out of time, Scott, but boy, I tell you, what a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing it with us this morning, man, and I really appreciate you. And pray that God is going to continue to bless you and use you to build up the kingdom, because I think you're just doing great work.
Thanks.
You're very, very welcome. Scott Woltze with us this morning here in our Conversion Corner on Seize the Day, and I am Gus Lloyd. And if you're interested, again, I want to give you his blog site. It's called bringustolife.blogspot.com. And if you just go to my website, gusloyd.com, after the show here, we'll get the Seize the Day show recap updated, and I'll give you a link to Scott Woltze's blog in our Conversion Corner. But what a fascinating story in that, again, you know, he had something of a difficult childhood. There was some abuse in the house at an early age, and he just rejected all forms of religion and God at about the age of 13, started robbing banks at the age of 18, got caught, did some time in prison. And interestingly enough, he, after he got out of prison, he went into academia and became a very learned man and said, in the eyes of the world, I was very successful, but nonetheless, I was still very empty. And then out of the blue, he had an encounter with God, this divine encounter, who showed him himself, God, in the person of Jesus Christ. And it was an immediate journey into the Catholic faith. So very, very interesting story there. Thanks to Scott Woltze for being with us this morning here on our Conversion Corner on Seize the Day on the Catholic Channel on SiriusXM 129.